Okay, that's Earth, Wind, and Fire Reasons. And why am I playing that song for this series of lectures? Because this is kind of what it all boils down to. Yeah, we're talking about the brain and the nervous system in this group of lectures. Let's take a look at an overview here. Okay, so basically, this lecture here is an introduction to the nervous system and to the rest of the stuff that we're going to talk about. So we're covering both chapters 2 and 3 in all of the lectures. I don't have one lecture for chapter 2 and one lecture for chapter 3, right? So that might be a little more difficult for you, but basically, hopefully the presentations all sort of gel together and makes good sense to you. In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about the nervous system. We're going to introduce it. We're going to talk about how it develops and some important aspects of the evolution of our nervous system. We're going to talk about what the structure of the nervous system is. That's sort of what this little schematic here on the right-hand side is for. It gives you an idea that we break the nervous system down into different components, right? And then we're going to explain the peripheral nervous system, yeah, and what it entails, what its functions are, and that sort of thing. And finally, we'll end up with a little activity where you get to name that nervous system. I give you an example of someone performing a behavior or something happening, and you get to identify which aspect of the nervous system you think is functioning at that moment. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the nervous system in general. In general, we're talking about, when we say someone's nervous system, we're talking about biological structures that allow for controlled complex behavior and promote homeostasis. When we say controlled complex behavior, we're talking about more than just movement, right? We know that single-celled organisms can move, right? They have little flatulence, and they can sort of move around in the little in whatever fluid they're in and that sort of thing. We also know that plants can move, right? You brush your hand against one of those what are they called, like shy plants or whatever, and they fold up their leaves, yeah. And we know, that there are those plants that eat bugs and stuff, right? I forget what it's called, but anyway. So we know plants can move, but they don't have the kind of complex behavior that organisms can exhibit when they have a central nervous system. Yeah, complex behavior involving things like interacting with other objects, involving things like language, involving things like tool usage, and stuff like responding when one of our children is being threatened by whatever, a lion or a tiger or whatever in our ancestral history. Yeah, so we're able to have complex behavior that we can control. Yeah, that's one of the benefits of the nervous system. The other is to promote homeostasis. Yeah, our nervous system is set up such that we have several different systems that work somewhat like the gas and the brake in a car do. Yeah, so we have some systems that energize us, that focus our attention, that motivate us to move towards a goal or away from a possible danger, right? That kind of stuff. But we also have systems that help to slow us down, that help to calm us down, help to slow our heart rate and that sort of thing. Because think about it, you know, um, if you're almost in a car accident, right? For example, right? You come screeching to a halt, and boy, you just almost hit that other car, but nobody got hit, and everybody's okay, and you can move on. You need your body and your brain to calm back down, right? You got a rush of adrenaline and such all at once, but then you have to be able to go on with your day. If you spend the rest of the day that enervated, that activated, you're not going to be able to get much stuff done, right? You're going to be constantly really anxious and that sort of thing. So we need both gas and brake, and we're going to talk about what those are and how those work and that sort of thing. We divide up the nervous system into two main components. Yeah, the central nervous system, or CNS, and that refers to our brain and our spinal cord only. Yeah. Then we have the peripheral nervous system, right? Outside of that central nervous system, we have nerves. Yeah. So what are nerves? We're referring basically to bundles of neuron fibers that are actually axons of neurons. and they all root together in different areas, not only in the peripheral nervous system, but also in the central nervous system. So we'll see examples of that. So when you hear the word nerves, we're talking basically about axons, typically. Yeah, and typically those are myelinated axons. So you're going to see white matter, white material. Yeah, and we'll talk about the difference between those two as well, just not in this lecture. So let's talk a little bit about how the nervous system develops. Okay, so on the top here we have the central nervous system of various vertebrate animals. Right on the left-hand side we have a mouse, then we have a cat, a dog, a rhesus monkey, a chimpanzee, and then finally a human. And you can see that that each brain looks very different from the other. Right, the two closest resemblances really are between the chimpanzee and the human, but even there we see a big difference. Yeah, and part of that, is just in the amount, the volume of material. Yeah, but it's more than that. Yeah, so like you'll notice for the mouse, it's a very smooth surface, right? We don't have a lot of convolutions there, so that means that there isn't a lot of material that's folded over and compressed in there. Yeah. However, when you look at the cat and the dog, you start to see those convolutions. Those are sulci and gyri. So there are gullies in the brain and then bumps in the brain, right? We'll talk about those, but you'll notice that it just becomes more and more complex as we go from one animal to the next. You'll also notice, just from your personal experience, that the level of complex behavior that's available to each of these organisms with these different central nervous systems is very different, right? So yeah, like you might say, well, a mouse and a cat and a dog are all kind of the same and that kind of thing. But realize though, dogs have much more capability to interact with their world, to identify threats, those sorts of things, than a mouse does. Yeah, mouse is much more basic interaction with the world. Yeah, and then for example too, with the difference between a chimpanzee and a rhesus monkey. Yeah, the chimpanzees we know use tools, right? They'll use a stick. They'll put a stick inside of a termite mound and pull it out, and covered with the termites that they get to then eat, and so we've observed that chimpanzees actually go and they collect these twigs, right, and they use them, right, and that's tool usage, right? So what does this matter? Why is this important? Well, because one of the common misconceptions that people have is that the human brain is the biggest, and that's why we're at the top of the food chain here. Yeah, and that's not accurate, right? Just for example, we know that elephants have bigger brains than human beings do. So we can look at it in terms of a ratio. Well, how about for body size? Do we have the biggest brain based on our body size? The ratio of brain to body size and that sort of thing? Actually, no, we don't. Dolphins have a bigger brain. Either way you want to look at it, whether it's we compare it ratio to body size or we compare it just the size of their brain to ours, theirs is bigger and heavier. Yeah. Whales have obviously have bigger brains, and they also have that bigger ratio as well. So if it's not the size of the brain, then what is it that sets us apart? Yeah, why is it that we are sitting around talking on computers and driving cars and such, and dolphins are swimming around in the ocean with no tools, and they don't have the kinds of developed society that we do. Yeah, we'll talk about that more when we get into the evolutionary aspects of the course and such. But speaking of evolution, let's look at the bottom of this picture here. So we know that human beings haven't always been the same. Yeah, if you consider our ancestry in terms of like a tree of life, right, or that sort of thing, we're more like a bush. Yeah, and what we are is a bush where every single one of the branches has died out except for one. Yeah, and that one is Homo sapiens. Okay, so but we've come out of a huge a myriad of different bipedal sort of ape-like creatures. Yeah, and one of the things that we can notice here that's important to notice is the difference. I'm going to pull up my pen here. So look at Australopithecus here, right? Look at the skull structure, and notice how from the orbital bone, the forehead basically slants back at a pretty strong angle. Yeah. Then we look over here at Homo habilis. Now he's got a little bit more of a bigger brain and a little bit less of that strong ridge line there. Yeah. Then we look at Homo erectus. Holy moly! Look at this big brow bone here, and then the forehead tilts back at a very strong angle. Now that's very different here from Homo sapiens, from what we are. Notice how the forehead goes up, right? And then it goes back. Yeah, big difference. All these other ones, it goes straight back. So what's the difference there? The difference is in our frontal lobe. Yeah, that's what's causing the difference in our skull structure. Yeah, and so why is that important? Well, because we can also see that as the frontal lobe developed, we see that we've also got all of these different aspects of writing, agriculture, early art, use of fire. All this stuff began roughly about 1 million years ago. Yeah. Before that, we had folks with crude stone tools. They had a basic material culture where they make a cutting tool out of a piece of obsidian or that sort of thing, and then they keep that cutting tool with them, right? They might strap that piece of obsidian onto a stick or that kind of thing, yeah. But we didn't see the kind of organization and sophistication and complexity that we do with our current cultures and such until basically halfway through Homo erectus and the beginning of Homo sapiens. Yeah. Then all of a sudden we see this rapid increase in the complexity of our culture and tools and that sort of thing. Yeah. Almost comparably, it is almost 1 million years, but it's also a very brief period of time. If you look at it basically from about 500,000 years ago, it's just a rapid increase. We've also got an increase in cerebral volume. Yeah. So our brains weren't always the way that they are now. Yeah. And one of the important differences is that what we've got now is a much more developed, way more sizable frontal lobe. Yeah. And so when we talk about what the frontal lobe does and that sort of thing, we also want to keep in mind that it's assumed that that frontal lobe is what has allowed all of these wonderful technological advances, such as agriculture and building and language and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Okay. But let's take a look at some of the complexity that we have in our central nervous system. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you've got the sorry about that. You've got the image from your text. This is basically an embryonic vertebrate brain. Yeah, when we're gestating inside our mothers, when we're fetuses and that sort of thing, it starts off, obviously with 2 cells that divide into 4 and so on and so forth. And then we form a tube. A tube gets formed that it basically slowly develops into our central nervous system. So that tube forms the spinal cord, also forms the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Yeah, and you can see too that the text, that there's all different kinds of nomenclature for naming the different parts of the brain and that kind of thing. One of the main forms of nomenclature is the notion of the telencephalon, the diencephalon, metencephalon, myencephalon, those sorts of things. Yeah, and the reason for that is because, as you can see, this is how it starts off. One of the earliest obvious divisions, right, is between the spinal cord, the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. Yeah, and then over here on the right-hand side, this just gives you an idea that this green part of this neural tube that's in the fetus develops into our hindbrain, which allows for different aspects of our autonomic nervous system and survival, right? So like respiration and our heartbeat and that sort of thing. And then the blue part here of this tube develops into the midbrain, which is partially the limbic system and that sort of thing, and allows us to have emotion and recognize threats and all that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay, so This is an extremely complex, the most complex organ, the most complex system that man has ever come across is the brain, our central nervous system. And you're going to see why. By the time we get to the end of this, you're probably going to be overwhelmed. I know I was when I first started to learn about this stuff. So there's a ton of different things, different aspects to take a look at. Before we jump into the naming and all that kind of stuff, let's talk just a little bit more about the complexity of the human brain. Okay. Something else to pay attention to is that at the outside covering of our brain is called the cerebral cortex, right? And so if you look down here, this is a slice at the underneath of the brain. Up here is these are the frontal lobes right here, okay? And then back here, this is the occipital lobe back here. Okay, but what really matters though is you can see that there's this layer sort of gray tissue, right, that is folded along in the brain, right, and you've got these areas, these ridges, and then these dips, I guess we would call them, right? These are gyri and sulci, and we'll talk about each one in a little bit. But what I want you to know is that this layer here, this about a 1/4 inch layer of gray matter that covers our cerebral hemispheres, this is called the cerebral cortex. Yeah, and it's what's amazing about it is that it's sort of been folded like origami. Yeah, it's been folded like origami. So if we flatten out all of these ridges and gaps and dips and all that other stuff, what we come out with is an area about the size of 4 sheets of typing paper. Yeah, 8.5 by 11-inch typing paper. So this is a huge amount of material to have crammed into the brain, right? And what's one of the things, again too, that led us to think that it was just the size of our brains that made the difference was when we compare this to our closest our closest representatives in the animal kingdom, such as the chimpanzees. It's a huge difference, right? We've got 4 sheets of paper and they've got 1. Then if you go down below that to the monkeys, right, they've got about a postcard size of cerebral cortex, and then rats have about a postage stamp. Yeah. So so there is obviously a clear size difference. There's also an immense level of complexity that we've got going on here. Yeah. But we also know that the thing that separates us from the animals is not the size of our brains. It's not the weight of our brains. Yeah. It's the abilities that our brains are capable of that make the difference. Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the divisions of the nervous system. So in our human nervous system, we basically have 2 parts. We've got the peripheral nervous system that we're going to talk about today, and then we've got the central nervous system that we're going to talk about in the next couple of lectures. So this is a good visual that shows you how the central nervous system is basically the brain and the spinal cord, and that's it. Yeah, these 2 orange parts here. And what does it consist of? Mostly relay or interneurons. Yeah, remember we talked about the different kinds of neurons. Versus the peripheral nervous system, which are all these nerves in the face, along the neck. They extend out all along the body. Yeah. So cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and what we call peripheral nerves. Yeah. What do these contain? What is the peripheral nervous system mostly made of? It's made up mostly of sensory and motor neurons, right? Which, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because what do we need to do? We need to bring in information, and we need to use that information then to direct our behavior, right? Our body. So our brain is, taking in all of our sensory information. It computes it, right? It analyzes it, it organizes it, it processes it. And then it uses that information to direct our muscles and our skeletal system and such to respond. Yeah. So sensory and motor neurons, right? We'll take a look at a schematic now. Okay, this is your basic sort of schematic. I know you don't have this in your text, but I think this will be useful to you to be able to see. So central nervous system, brain and spinal cord here, right? And keep these separate. We're not going to worry about those for this lecture, and we're talking instead about the peripheral nervous system, which we can divide. It contains both sensory neurons and motor neurons. Yeah. When we talk about motor neurons, we're talking about central nervous system to the muscles and to the glands, right? And then sensory neurons, these are sensory organs to the central nervous system. So for example, we have sensory neurons in our skin and our fingertips, right? So when you touch your finger to your desk or your keypad or whatever, you feel that touch, yeah. And that's basically your sensory organs, your sensory neurons firing, sending that message up to the spinal cord and then up to the brain, saying you are now touching your keyboard. You are pressing on the letter L. You're now pressing on the letter A. That sort of thing, right? So when we break down the peripheral nervous system a little bit more, what we come up with are what are called the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems, okay? And that's down below here. Okay, and so the somatic nervous system is what controls our voluntary movements. And what does that mean? It allows us to do what we need to do, right? So you need to turn the page in your book. You need to make a phone call, all that sort of stuff. That's all thanks to the somatic nervous system. If you're going to type an email, that's your somatic nervous system. It controls your voluntary movements. Yeah. Divide that, or that's contrasted with the autonomic nervous system, which is basically for involuntary behavior. Yeah. So what kind of involuntary behavior do we have? Well, when you hear the word involuntary, you're thinking against my wishes or that sort of thing, right? Like I was involuntarily restricted or that sort of thing. That's not really what it means. What it means is that you don't think about this behavior. Yeah. So autonomic, you can think of as automatic. Yeah, that's one of the ways that I remembered it. Yeah, different from somatic, which I used to think of as so. Yeah. So who cares about the somatic nervous system, because I needed to memorize the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system we can divide into the gas and the brake. Okay, sympathetic division. Sympathetic nervous system, part of the autonomic nervous system, and what it does is it pours on the gas. It activates us. Yeah, in situations in which we recognize we are in danger. Typically what that means is it gives us the adrenaline and the focus of attention and such to escape from that danger. Yeah, a tiger is coming to our cave, and we see that tiger, we get a rush of adrenaline. We can either fight or flight. Typically, though, the smartest thing is to get the heck out of there, right? Who wants to fight a tiger with a sharp stick? I sure don't. Yeah. So, but fight or flight, we also have, sometimes you can't get out of the cave. There's nothing you can do, right? And so rolling over and just being a meal for the tiger is probably not what we want to do. So we have that energy and such. The least we can do is try and defend ourselves. So fight or flight, yeah? So that's the gas part of the autonomic nervous system. The brake part is the parasympathetic nervous system, yeah, and this refers to our rest or digest. Yeah, you can think of it that way. Yeah, it's the brake. And so when the parasympathetic division is activated, it's helping us to slow down. Yeah. For example, when we eat food, yeah, our parasympathetic nervous system goes into function in part to push blood to our digestive system, to allow us to digest that food and pull out the nutrients from it that we need, get those nutrients to the different body systems to push the blood, to have the liver clean the blood, and all that other good stuff, right? So rest or digest, that's the brake portion of the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so another image for you. Peripheral nervous system, again, we're breaking down into voluntary or involuntary. Yeah. So we've got in the voluntary part the somatic nervous system. Yeah. And you want to remember, so what do we have in that somatic nervous system? We've got your cranial nerves and we've got your spinal nerves. Yeah. And so what does this mean? Well, these are the nerves that bring us the sensory information. Yeah. So we have cranial nerves that are in our face and along our skull and that sort of thing, and tell us that there's a fly buzzing our ear, right? That sort of information. Then we have our spinal nerves that travel throughout the rest of our body and bring us information all those other different sources. Yeah. Then we have the involuntary aspect, right? The autonomic nervous system, right? And this again gets divided into two: the relaxation and stimulation, right? Sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay. So what's important here is just to remember we're talking gas and brake, right? But then, so we're going to talk about next thing we're going to do is that name that nervous system, yeah. And one of the things I want to remind you too is that we have more than just that autonomic nervous system. We also have the somatic nervous system. Okay, so we want you to look out for that as well. All right, so let's give this activity a try. Okay. Okay. So, upper left-hand corner, we see a gentleman sort of relaxing in the swimming pool, right? And this is, we're saying relaxation. So, is this person experiencing any threat or any danger or anything like that? It doesn't look that way. Yeah. So, obviously, then the brakes, right? He's got the brakes going on here. So, what would that be? Would that be sympathetic or parasympathetic? Okay. And so please write down your answer now. Obviously I'm not going to see it. This is already recorded and stuff, but it's a good practice for you, yeah, to make sure that you have this sense in your head. So would this guy resting in the swimming pool, would this be parasympathetic or sympathetic? All right. And then I'm gonna let you know what it is. So if you haven't written it down, pause this, write it down, and then I'm about to tell you. Okay. All right, so for the gentleman sleeping or resting in the pool, he's got the parasympathetic nervous system activated. Yeah, and how do we know that? Because there's no threat or danger. He's relaxing. He's obviously got the brakes on. Yeah, he's chilling out. Okay. Next image over here is a gentleman who's running away from a bull, right? And so, already we've got someone who's activated, right? Who's responding to a threat. Yeah. So what does that tell you? We know it's not parasympathetic. Yeah. So here's someone who's seeing a threat and they've got energy and they're looking at the threat and they're saying, I need to move in this direction, right? So write down what you think that may be, and then I'm going to tell you what it is. Okay? I'm going to give you a count of 5 to write down what you think it is. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So for this gentleman, we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system. Now, and you can't even see it because I got this stupid line through it. There, take that out. There we go. So it is the sympathetic nervous system. Yeah. Once again, he's got the gas going. Yeah. So then we can look down here, and third picture down here. This is a boxing match. Yeah. And you'll note too that it's a couple of females in the boxing match, which is a fairly new development, and always welcome to see equality in sports and such. Yeah. Okay, so what's happening in a boxing match, right? Are we talking about threat? Are we talking about danger? I would say we are. If you've ever been in a boxing match, you're going to say, yeah, there's some threat that you can get punched in the face, and that's not a pleasant experience, right? So, which nervous system do you think is going to be functioning here? Is it the same one that the gentleman's using in the swimming pool, or is it the same one that the gentleman's using running away from the bull? Yeah. Well, obviously, you have to be activated, right? You have to be able to respond to the threat. You have to look for the punches coming at you, right? Duck those punches and throw your own back and such. So obviously, you're going to need the gas, yeah, and the gas means sympathetic nervous system, right? Okay, so we've got those fairly cleared out. Now, this final picture here is someone typing on their laptop, yeah. Now, so this is trickier. This is a little more difficult, right? Why is it trickier and more difficult? Because we're not seeing someone relaxing. Yeah, they got a cup of coffee there, but they're active. They're doing something, right? We don't know what they're typing. Yeah, but so we're seeing someone who's typing on a laptop. We don't see a threat. We don't see them, not doing anything like the gentleman in the pool is doing, right? So what nervous system might be functioning here? Yeah. If it's not sympathetic and parasympathetic, what are your other options? Right. Somatic. So the somatic nervous system is what's doing our voluntary behavior, right? And so we're voluntarily typing on our laptop. Yeah. It isn't a question of risk or threat or anything like that. Yeah. So it's our somatic nervous system that allows us to exhibit voluntary behavior. Now you might be asking yourself, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. This guy running away from the bull up here, yeah, he's exhibiting voluntary behavior. He's running, and that's his choice, right? And that is true, right? So what does that mean? That means that there's an interaction, yeah, between the two nervous systems. We've got sympathetic and somatic activating at the same time, yeah. And that makes sense because we need that somatic nervous system in order to direct our behavior. Yeah. If we just have sympathetic nervous system activation, right, then that gives us energy and such. But it doesn't help us then to evade or avoid the danger, right? We need an aspect of voluntary behavior to say, I'm not going to run towards the bull, I'm going to run away. Yeah. So you don't need to worry about that for the exam. I'm not going to be parsing it that narrowly. Yeah. But just suffice it to say that even when someone's relaxing in the pool there, right? He's also using his somatic nervous system. For example, when he bumps up against the side of the pool and he pushes himself away, right? That's a somatic aspect. Yeah. But easiest to say that when we're talking about fight or flight, we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system. When we're talking about rest or digest, we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system. And when we're talking about voluntary behavior, we're talking about the somatic nervous system. Okay, so that's going to do it for this lecture. Very brief. The other two lectures are going to be a little bit longer, just to warn you. The information that we're going to be covering in the next two lectures includes the structure of the central nervous system. We'll look at a brief video on Phineas Gage and talk about why he's important. We'll look at the cerebral hemispheres and white and gray matter. We'll talk about brain divisions and neuroanatomy nomenclature. We'll look at the different lobes of the brain and their different functions. We'll also give you a neuroanatomy demonstration from the University of Utah. We have a quick discussion of brain structures and functions. We'll talk about how the nervous system has been studied. We'll talk about neuroimaging, and then finally brain manipulation techniques in the coming two lectures. Okay. All right. So that'll do it until part two. And or unless if you have any questions or anything like that, please contact me. I'm more than happy to explain this stuff in greater detail. But until lecture two, hui ho.